Welcome back for my series of talks on From Art to Science in Search of Reality. I'm Marcello Costa, Emeritus Professor at Flinders University. Well, I covered from the very beginning of history of painting in the caves to the way to Rome and the decadence of Christianity. Then we concluded that space becomes pictorial with the Renaissance, that painting became linear geometry with the Renaissance, and space became therefore geometric with Galileo Galilei. Geometry became algebra and algebra became geometry. Geometric space became mathematics with Descartes in the 1600s. Geometry of space extended to dynamics with Newton at the beginning of the 1700s. Then, of course, non-Euclidean geometries for space in the 1800s developed into the Einstein theory of relativity. Then I discussed the fractal geometry, a suitable new geometry for all natural structures. Then I went on to the nonlinear dynamics of physics, chaos theory, and then the ability to make geometry or graphic representation of dynamic phenomena in spatio-temporal maps and talking about four-dimensional objects. So now we are ready to go back to painting. In this part 6, I'm going to cover the area of painting beyond visual reality. You remember I left you in the painting with the enormous amount of reality in the 1700s, where painting reached maximal representation of details of what is up there when we look at the world. This example by Caroletto, Il Laboratorio dei Marmi, 1727, when enormous detail looked like real pictures taken from a camera. They knew the perspective so well that they could make almost sampan, this Hogarth false perspective in 1754, showing people talking across from a hill to a top of a house, or a completely unrealistic space, or in this case, of course, connecting two separate buildings with the same object. In other words, you remember that even the modern time of Escher developed similar paradoxes. But this only showed that people had already full control of the proper geometry to represent perspective in a very realistic way. Yet, the visual world is full of complexity. We know that when we grow, when we are born, we begin to see very complex patterns, and the patterns in the world are really not already designed by any painter. They are built by the brain initially in a very, very complex way. Leonardo already realized this when he tried to portray details of nature, something that was very hard to portray, like a storm or waves or winds. So he was aware of how difficult it is to detail in enormously the complexity of nature. In the 1700s, the painter was still attempting to paint every single detail, every single leaf of trees, every single twigs of herbs and pastures. And yet, they realized that was no longer possible to do a good job because it was too complicated, too long, and suddenly something happened. The beginning of Romanticism. In the early 1800s, Turner from England, really, he was painting in Italy, by the way, in the Val d'Aosta, in the Aosta Valley. He began to paint something more indirect, not the detail, but just simply some impressions. Impression became more important in painting. Remarkable, big revolution in painting Turner did. That was the beginning of a century that eventually saw the beginning of the French Impressionism, that arose with the title given to a Claude Monet painting, Impressions of a Sun Rising. Here is in 1872. He exhibited this work in 1974, together with Camille Pissarro, Alfred Sisley, Edouard Manet, Paul Cézanne, Edgar Degas, and many other artists. They created a movement that was very, very novel in the style of painting. They had some principles. They prefer painting in the open air instead of the studies. They abolished outlines as these are regarded as an intellectual invention. They realized that was an invention of the brain, putting outlines like the early paintings did. They were in search for the light moment, a moment in which light was given a particular sense of presence, used mainly primary and secondary colors. They abolished perspective. The image is a time fragment of continuous change of point of view. They did not want to paint buildings for that reason. They were more stable. They painted natural events which are changing with light and during the day. They certainly dislike the art in the academies, whether that academies in France or in Rome, which were the central academies for painting at the time. Well, examples. Claude Monet, Springtime Through the Branches. He wants really to paint the feeling of the air across these almost non-visible plants. The same Claude Monet, color without geometrical shapes, typical of one of his Pond's reflections at the end of the 1800s. There's nothing very specific, but clearly give the true impression of a reflection on a pond. He produced about 50 paintings in the Cathedral of Rouen. In his small apartment, office change canvas every 15 minutes, painting that portray different moment in the day and in the weather, and focus on the same subject through a whole series of painting. Monet was able to concentrate on recording visual sensations themselves. So he was really reflecting on the way that he was experiencing rather than painting reality. And continues, the poplars, repetition of subjects in nature at different times of the day and different seasons. You see an enormous similarity, and yet every moment is different. The famous haystacks, different seasons, different moment of the day, the same haystacks. Very famous exercise of going beyond what was the reality of the haystacks in absolute, but really realizing that they were always different in every moment of experience of an observer, and therefore he painted that. Corot also created a sense of timeless, a moment between timeless and a single moment in time. Of course, Pierre Auguste Renoir, capturing a particular moment of the humankind, like a picture, but like a moment in a social event where the details are not important, but the expression of people and movement are important. The Bal du Moulin, de la Galette. Then we had in Italy something in parallel, a bit earlier, the verismo, from Italian vero means true, a kind of veridity, refers to the 19th century Italian painting style, capturing also the moment of simple life. This style was practiced more characteristically by the macchiaioli, the Stein style, little dots, spots, group of painters who were forerunners of the French impressionists. You can see here that the leaves are not painted one by one, but with a sense of impression of a moment in the open air also. They continue this realistic, new realism, social realism, they call that. Romanticism was rejected. Reality of human life was more important. This Angelo Morbello Sunday dawn, when people are coming back from church probably. Giovanni Sedantini, the sad hour, the afternoon time when the cows need to be treated well, and a sense of sadness during the day. Well, my own painting, back to when I was 14, I already discovered a way to, if you like, to make a shortcuts. I didn't paint all the leaves of the trees. I gave impressions of the leaves of a tree. So in addition to having discovered on my own the perspective of line, I also discovered the idea of impressionism. Going back to a very famous impressionist, Charles Legrand, the couple, Dan Larue. You can see an enlargement is made really of dots, of spots, not of enormous detail, but you have no doubt as to what you're actually seeing. Going back to the ancient Rome, Pompeii 64 AD, a painting that was probably already many decades earlier. The Romans already used a simplification of painting. The detail are no longer per se important, so they were already hinting at impressionism before the decadence of the art, with the, if you like, the invasion of the Christianity, which in a way destroyed the painting style and reality of the Romans achieved. It had to wait to return until, in fact, the impressionism of the 1800s. Then we had the post-impressionists, Van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Georges Seurat, Henry Toulouse-Lautrec, Camille Pissarro, Paul Cézanne. These artists were slightly younger than the Impressionists, and their work is known as post-impressionism. An example of Georges Seurat, like pointillism, little dots. In a way, this is really a further change of way of looking at the world in a more realistic, but not really true to life. Paul Signac, Ville de Port de Marseille in 905, with an equal luminosity made of little spots, again, very post-impressionist. Camille Pissarro painted the streets of Paris, Boulevard Montmartre. Again, you can see the detail are really missing, and it's only hinting and really implies that the observer has abilities of building a full image without the painter having to be so precise. So by the early 1900s, Impressionism succeeded in portraying realistically complex social and environmental natural events by incomplete representation of details, only hinting at reality, leaving the observer to complete the visual experience. Painting, once attained full realistic impressions, intended to go beyond space and classic perspective. And we have the beginning of modern painting in the 1900s. Here we have a Paul Cézanne, a desire to escape the single moment and a single point of view. This painting is like it's painted by a painter from different point of view. Of course, it's an illusion. It's a pictorial attempt to overcome the limitation of a single view of the world with simultaneous vision. Of course, this is not possible, and movies have developed that ability, but we simply cannot see the world for more than one time at a particular moment from a particular point of view in the world. So this was an attempt that really was very unrealistic, a desire that indeed produced great art, but not any advancement in the true movement from art to science. Then pictorial attempts to overcome the limitation of simple view of the world, the Cubism of George Braque and Pablo Picasso, where they tried to translate the impressions that the brain had into images which were only hint even further away from reality, thinking that eventually the brain is free from looking at something real and is free to merge that with a complete, total imagination. This, of course, gave rise to the very famous Pablo Picasso, where the hint of reality changed even the nature of what he was seeing, like the famous Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. They remain women with a sense of reality very different from what they were using, even the Impressionists, or the famous Picasso City women with a face that is no longer very real. And yet we regard this art. Why, by the way? I think because Pablo Picasso achieved a maximum ability to paint reality when he was 13, 14. He painted like the top painters of the Renaissance when he was already a teenager. So he felt free to go beyond that and explore the way in which his brain really was working. We'll return on this a bit later. Then some painters like Rudolf Schlichtner, they tried to go beyond reality, more than reality. They didn't abandon realism. You can see clearly what is there, but it's a kind of a surrealism, more than reality. Of course, again, an exploration of the imagination rather than the real world. Fantastic Salvador Dali, these two paintings, the persistent memory or lugubrious game, they are enormous exercise of an imagination beyond reality, still made of funny real bits. He claimed himself he was doing this after waking up in the morning and having a drink and before having a kind of a lucid dream. He was painting his lucid dreams, fundamentally. Again, an enormous exploration of imagination. Salvador Dali wanted to go beyond the three dimensions that one can actually portray in sculpture, or two dimensions with the geometry of perspective or space in two dimensions. Try to imagine the hypercube that geometers had in mind by creating this idea of a corpus hypercubus crucifixion. We are really in really modern times. Robbins, of course, painted this in a very abstract way, implying multiple perspectives to place the viewer in several positions at once as depiction of hyperspace. Again, not very credible, not very realistic, more an attempt to see what the brain can imagine. Searching for this four-dimensional painting, this Caribbean tea time by Hockney, like a portrait that you expected to turn around and see different sides from different point of view at the same time. Again, this was an attempt to go beyond reality in painting. So I end this part 6, painting beyond visual reality, because painting reaches the limit of visual representation. It opens the postmodernity with the end of painting, as Robert Hughes proposed in his BBC series in a book published in 1980, The Shock of a New, Art and the Century of Change. He thought that was, as I agree with him, the end of painting of reality. Therefore, visual art is indeed ready, since it was time to address the inner space of the mind. And I hope you're going to follow me in next part 7. Cheer up!